By the time the snow started swallowing the highway outside Red Hollow, Wyoming, Caleb Mercer already knew he had made a mistake buying the cabin. Not because of the price. Not because the locals in town had stared at him like a man signing his own death certificate. And not because his retired service dog, Atlas, had refused to take his eyes off the fireplace from the moment they walked inside. It was the silence that bothered him. Not ordinary mountain silence. This felt different. The kind that waited. The kind that listened back. The county auction had taken place 3 days earlier inside a faded brick administration building in the small town of Briar Creek. The air smelled like wet boots, old paper, and stale coffee burned too long on a heating plate. Caleb had sat near the back beside Atlas while locals whispered behind folded hands. Most of them knew each other. None of them knew him. Caleb Mercer was 48 years old, lean from years in the Army, with tired blue eyes and a crooked scar beside his jaw that disappeared beneath several days of rough beard. He dressed simply. Flannel shirt, old denim jacket, dark jeans, work boots. Nothing about him invited conversation. Atlas rested beside his chair with the quiet discipline of a dog, who had spent years saving lives in places neither of them liked remembering. The Belgian Malinois had grown older now. Silver threaded through his dark coat around the muzzle and ears, but his amber eyes remained sharp, always watching. The auctioneer droned through seized vehicles and abandoned properties while rain tapped against the courthouse windows. Then the room changed. "All right," the auctioneer muttered, adjusting his glasses. "Parcel 9C, locally known as the Hawthorne Ridge property." A strange stillness spread through the room. Even the coughing stopped. 70 acres, 1 cabin, water well status unknown. Property transferred through tax delinquency after 14 years of unpaid county taxes. 14 years. The number seemed to settle heavily over everyone present. Caleb noticed people glance toward him. Nobody else lifted a bidding paddle. "We'll start at $400. Caleb raised his hand once. "That's 400 from the gentleman in the back. Do I hear 5? Silence. A rancher near the front quietly shook his head at Caleb, as if warning him away from a cliff edge. Going once, Atlas lifted his head slightly. Going twice, the gavel cracked. Sold. The sound echoed harder than it should have. On the way out, Caleb overheard whispers. That place ain't right. Thought Blackstone Energy would finally get it. They kept trying. Should stayed buried. The county clerk avoided eye contact while handing him the paperwork. Her hands trembled slightly. Outside, the rain had turned colder. Atlas pressed against Caleb's leg while they walked toward the truck. "You hear all that?" Caleb muttered softly. Atlas only looked toward the mountains. The road to Hawthorne Ridge twisted through pine forests and narrow ridgelines north of Briar Creek. Civilization slowly disappeared behind them until only wilderness remained. Caleb liked that part. After Afghanistan, crowds had become exhausting. Noise felt exhausting. Most people assumed soldiers missed combat after retirement. They were wrong. What men like Caleb missed was clarity. Out here, things either wanted to kill you or they didn't. Simple. The dirt trail leading toward the property felt strangely maintained despite appearing abandoned. Fallen branches had been pushed aside recently. Tire tracks disappeared beneath fresh mud. Small things, easy to miss, but not to Caleb. Atlas sat upright in the passenger seat, ears twitching at every movement beyond the trees. When they finally reached the clearing, the cabin stood beneath heavy gray clouds like something forgotten by time itself. Dark timber walls, sagging porch, stone chimney coated in moss. No smoke, no sound. Caleb shut off the engine. For a long moment, neither he nor Atlas moved. Then Atlas quietly growled. Not aggressive, uneasy. The cabin smelled like cold ash and old wood. Dust floated through weak afternoon light spilling across warped floorboards. A rusted stove sat near the wall. A faded wool blanket still covered a chair beside the window, and on the table rested a ceramic coffee mug beside an open notebook, like someone had stepped away mid-sentence. Caleb slowly walked through the room. No signs of looting, no vandalism, just abandonment frozen in time. Atlas ignored everything except the fireplace. The dog approached the stone hearth slowly, muscles rigid beneath his coat. His nose moved along the cracks between the stones before he let out a low whine deep in his throat. Caleb crouched beside him. "What is it?" Atlas pawed once at the base of the fireplace, then again. Caleb studied the stone carefully, nothing obvious. Still, Atlas refused to leave it. That night, the temperature collapsed after sunset. Snow began around midnight. By morning, the mountains had vanished behind white. Caleb stayed busy reinforcing windows and hauling supplies inside before the storm worsened. Atlas remained restless all day. He paced near the fireplace constantly, watching, listening. When darkness returned, the blizzard arrived fully. Wind slammed against the cabin walls hard enough to shake dust from the rafters. Snow hammered the windows. The entire world disappeared beneath roaring white chaos. Caleb built a fire. Atlas immediately backed away from the hearth. Not from fear of flames, from something beneath them. The dog started whining again, then scratching. Easy. Atlas ignored him. His claws scraped furiously against one particular stone near the center base of the fireplace. Caleb stared at it. The mortar surrounding the slabs looked newer than the rest. Not new, just different. Atlas barked sharply. The sound jolted through the cabin. "All right," Caleb muttered. "All right." He grabbed the crowbar from his tool bag and wedged it carefully beneath the edge. At first, nothing happened. Then the seal cracked. A cold draft breathed upward from below. The stone shifted. Atlas immediately stopped barking. Caleb dragged the slab aside and lifted the lantern over the opening. A hidden compartment. Inside sat several weatherproof cases and a stack of leather journals wrapped tightly in canvas. Caleb climbed down carefully. The journals belonged to Nathan Hale. The name appeared repeatedly throughout the notebooks. Nathan Hale had been an investigative reporter from Denver, who moved to Briar Creek 15 years earlier after receiving anonymous reports about groundwater contamination tied to Blackstone Energy. The further Caleb read, the darker the story became. Illegal dumping, bribed inspectors, poisoned wells, cancer clusters quietly buried beneath falsified environmental reports. Nathan had documented everything, every payment, every meeting, every threat. The final entries became frantic. Someone was pressuring county officials to bankrupt him through fabrications and property disputes. They wanted him gone. One sentence near the end froze Caleb completely. "If anything happens to me, the evidence beneath the fireplace must reach federal investigators. Sheriff Doyle is compromised. Trust nobody local." Atlas suddenly growled. Low, sharp. Caleb extinguished the lantern instantly. Headlights moved faintly beyond the storm outside. A vehicle. Nobody should have been out here. The engine stopped near the cabin. Then came heavy footsteps crunching through snow. A knock sounded against the door. 3 slow knocks. Atlas positioned himself silently beside Caleb. Another knock. "This is Sheriff Doyle," a voice shouted through the storm. "Need to make sure you're safe in this weather." Caleb looked toward the hidden compartment. Too late to move everything. He slid the stone mostly back into place and scattered ash across the seams before opening the door slightly. Sheriff Warren Doyle stood outside wearing a thick county jacket dusted with snow. Mid-50s, broad shoulders, hard eyes, the kind of man who smiled without warmth. "Hell of a storm," Doyle said casually while scanning the cabin interior. "So I noticed." Doyle stepped inside uninvited. Atlas immediately stiffened. The sheriff noticed. "That dog always this friendly? He's selective." Doyle laughed softly. His gaze drifted toward the fireplace, then back to Caleb. "You settling in okay?" "Doing fine. Find anything interesting around here?" The question hung heavily in the room. Caleb shrugged. "Old cabin, broken furniture, dust." Doyle studied him for several seconds, then nodded slowly. "Well, folks around here avoid this place for a reason. I heard the stories. Some stories exist to keep people alive." Caleb said nothing. The sheriff moved closer to the fire. "This mountain can be dangerous, especially for strangers who go digging into old business." There it was, not a warning. A message. Doyle eventually left. Atlas remained tense long after the SUV disappeared into the storm. Something bothered Caleb. He grabbed his flashlight and forced his way outside through waist-deep snow toward the truck. The rear tire had been slashed. Clean. Deliberate. The sheriff hadn't come to help. He had come to measure the threat. Inside the cabin, Caleb opened the metal cases hidden beneath the fireplace. Lab reports. Water samples, financial ledgers, USB drives. Photographs of dumping sites near local reservoirs. Enough evidence to destroy Blackstone Energy completely. Atlas stayed beside the door, ears locked toward the storm. Then came another sound. A different engine, more expensive, more confident. The next morning, a black luxury truck rolled into the clearing. The driver stepped out wearing an expensive winter coat and polished leather gloves. CEO of Blackstone Energy. Tall, silver-haired, calm. Dangerous men rarely looked dangerous. "Mr. Mercer," Grayson said pleasantly. "Beautiful property." Caleb stayed on the porch beside Atlas. "What do you want?" "To help you avoid unnecessary trouble. Grayson smiled faintly. I understand you recently discovered certain materials left behind by Nathan Hale. Caleb's expression never changed. I don't know what you're talking about. Of course you do. The smile disappeared. I'll offer you $75,000 for the property. Cash. Today. No, $100,000, no. Grayson studied Atlas. The dog stared back without blinking. You know, Grayson said quietly. Nathan Hale believed stubbornness made him brave too. Cold silence settled between them. Then Grayson stepped closer. You're isolated here. Storm coming tonight. Roads closing, nobody nearby. His voice lowered. Men disappear in mountains every winter. Atlas growled immediately, deep, threatening. Grayson glanced at the dog. For the first time, uncertainty flickered briefly across his face. Then he stepped back toward the truck. You should reconsider. The vehicle disappeared into the trees. Caleb already knew they were out of time. That afternoon, he drove 2 hours south to the city of Rockford Springs, using back roads to avoid being followed. At a public library, he scanned portions of Nathan Hale's evidence and sent encrypted copies to an old friend named Daniel Brooks, former Army Ranger, now an investigative journalist in Chicago. Caleb called him from a prepaid phone. If you don't hear from me by 6 tomorrow morning, Caleb said quietly, release everything to the FBI. Daniel understood immediately. No questions. That was friendship between old soldiers. By the time Caleb returned to Hawthorne Ridge, another storm had swallowed the mountains, bigger than the first. Atlas sensed the danger before nightfall. He kept circling the cabin perimeter restlessly, nose lifted into the wind. Caleb barricaded the windows and checked his rifle. The attack began shortly after midnight, not with shouting. With silence, Atlas heard them first. The dog rose instantly from beside the fire, body rigid. Then came the faint crunch of boots outside. Several people. Moving carefully. Caleb killed the lantern light. Darkness swallowed the cabin. A stool scraped softly against the back window. Atlas growled. Glass shattered. A masked man climbed through the opening, holding a pistol fitted with a suppressor. He never reached the floor. Atlas launched across the room like a missile. The dog hit the intruder midair, slamming him sideways into the wall, hard enough to knock the gun loose. The man screamed. Caleb moved instantly, driving the rifle stock into the attacker's wrist. Bone cracked. Outside, more footsteps approached. Another window exploded inward. Gunfire ripped through the cabin walls. Wood splintered everywhere. Atlas dragged the wounded intruder backward across the floor while Caleb fired once through the darkness. A man outside collapsed screaming into the snow. The fight became chaos. Smoke, shouting, muzzle flashes cutting through darkness. Atlas moved constantly between threats, warning Caleb seconds before every approach. Then, Elliot Grayson's voice thundered outside. Burn it! A bottle crashed through the front window. Gasoline spread instantly across the floorboards. Fire followed. The cabin erupted into flames. Heat slammed through the room like an explosion. Smoke rolled across the ceiling. Atlas stayed beside Caleb despite the fire closing around them. Move! Caleb shouted. They burst through the front door into blinding snow and firelight. 3 armed men waited outside. Grayson stood behind them holding a revolver. The burning cabin roared behind Caleb like a furnace. This ends now, Grayson shouted. Atlas planted himself in front of Caleb, teeth bared. Then came another sound. Helicopters. Several. Powerful rotor blades thundered overhead through the storm clouds. Searchlights cut through swirling snow. Voices boomed across loudspeakers. Federal agents, drop your weapons. Everything froze. Grayson looked upward in disbelief. One of his men immediately threw down his rifle. Another tried running. He disappeared beneath armed agents descending through the snow. Within seconds, the clearing filled with FBI tactical teams and state police vehicles pushing through the storm. Grayson slowly lowered his weapon. The fight ended not with glory, but exhaustion. Hours later, federal agents recovered the remaining evidence hidden beneath the Fireplace ruins. Nathan Hale's investigation finally surfaced after 14 years buried beneath fear and corruption. Sheriff Doyle was arrested 2 days later alongside multiple county officials and Blackstone executives. News crews flooded Briar Creek. Water investigations spread across Wyoming. Families learned the truth about illnesses that had haunted them for years. Spring eventually arrived in the mountains. The snow melted slowly around the burned remains of the cabin. Caleb stayed. Most people expected him to leave once everything ended, but leaving no longer felt right. Atlas sat beside him one evening, overlooking the valley, while workers began clearing debris from the old property. You know, Caleb murmured quietly, scratching behind the dog's ears. You could have ignored that fireplace. Atlas leaned against his leg heavily. Caleb smiled faintly. Good thing you didn't. The mountains remained silent around them. But for the first time in years, the silence no longer felt empty. It felt like peace.